When we think of body modification, we typically think of things like tattoos and piercings. But there exists another ancient and widespread practice that relatively recently has seen a sharp decline. That's the practice of artificial cranial modification. This practice involves the intentional reshaping of an infant's skull in order to elongate or widen the cranium. But what may be surprising is just how many cultures around the world have practiced cranial modification as an integral part of their society. Most people are probably familiar with the elongated skulls of South America, but archaeologists have found intentionally modified crania everywhere from North America and Africa, to Eastern Europe and Asia, to Hawaii and Australia. This was a very common practice. The earliest evidence we have for artificially modified crania comes from two Neanderthal skulls found in the Shanabar cave in what is now Iraq. So we know that pretty much everyone but Western Europeans intentionally modified their heads. But why did they do it? What sort of motivations would lead cultures to keep this as a practice for generations? Well, it turns out that these motivations aren't much different than why you or I might go to get a tattoo. And it starts with pure aesthetics and beauty. Some of the most well-known head modifiers are the Mangbetu in Central Africa. They use tight head wrappings around the skulls of infants to form an elongated shape. They express their admiration for the elongated skull through their numerous pieces of art. The women also wear a circular headdress hairstyle, which emphasizes the aesthetics of the cranium. Though the practice has largely faded in the last century, it can still be clearly observed in the elderly individuals. Another group famous for modifying their crania are the Mayans. The Mayans practiced two different forms of head shaping, one with the back of the skull standing straight up, and one with the front of the skull pushed back and elongated. Around the time of the Spanish conquests in the 16th century, a conversation was recorded between a Spanish missionary and a native Mayan. The missionary asked why the Mayans' heads looked so different, and the man responded by saying, "This is done because our ancestors were told by the gods that if our heads were thus formed, we would appear noble and handsome and better able to bear burdens." This man's statement provides great evidence for the Mayans' motivations for cranial modification. To look handsome and beautiful, but also to look noble and bear burdens, which leads me to the next motivational category for cranial modification, social status. This takes us first to Peru, where just under 500 modified skulls from around 6500 BC were found by archaeologists. The main purpose for this was to distinguish members of the ruling class from everyone else. Over time, it's believed that this practice became so widespread and beyond the ruling families that it became a way to distinguish between other social and ethnic groups. This happened because the ruling families allowed lesser noble families to modify their crania, and before too long, there were too many to distinguish a ruling family. This shows that the sole reason for beginning the practice of modifying crania in this society was social status. In this same area, around 6,000 years later, the Nazca civilization was thriving, and cranial modification was widespread as well. However, unlike their ancestors, ethnic identification was the sole purpose for it. The Nazca identified each other based on physical appearance, mainly the shape of their head. For this reason, we see many different types of cranial modification in a relatively small area. But what remains a mystery are the 40% of skulls found from this period that show no signs of modification. Anthropologists just aren't sure why the practice was so popular for about half of the population, but just under half did not take any part in the practice. Let's jump to the other side of the world and look at a culture that always seems to be shrouded in mystery, ancient Egypt. There's only one known instance of cranial modification from Egypt, but it involves the most infamous and enigmatic ruler of all, Akhenaten. A quick summary of Akhenaten's history. His reign began in 1375 BC, ending just 14 years later. His queen was Nefertiti, and he also took a consort known as the Younger Lady, with whom he produced a son named Tutankhamun, known to us as King Tut. We have the mummies of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and the Younger Lady, who all possess artificially modified crania. Nefertiti's remains have never been discovered, but she is depicted with an elongated cranium in Egyptian art from this period. Akhenaten wanted to change Egypt inside and out. Most notably, he changed the religion to a sun-worshipping monotheism, believing himself to be the direct descendant of the sun god. And for this reason, he changed how his line and family were depicted in art. We are concerned with the fact that all of his family members, as well as the officials who counseled the royal family, were shown with elongated crania. If this were true in reality and not just in art, it would be solid proof of an attempt to separate social classes using cranial modification. This idea was refuted for a while by scholars who thought art was not as reliable as physical remains. It's not difficult to believe that the pharaoh would have Tutankhamun's skull reformed as an infant, but other than that there was no proof of it being a widespread practice, until the mummy of the younger lady, Tutankhamun's mother, was found. This was the evidence needed to conclude that there was a serious attempt made by Akhenaten to incorporate cranial modification into Egyptian society for the purpose of distinguishing ruling classes, not unlike the Peruvian societies that existed 5,000 years prior to Akhenaten on the other side of the planet. Now we'll move to yet another region where cranial modification was widespread at one time, Eastern Europe. We have the most physical evidence from the Balkan Peninsula and the Carpathian Basin during the Hun Germanic period, which lasted from 400 to 500 AD. Tribes here would have included the Goths and the Huns. The European continent is not unique in regards to the reasons for practicing cranial modification, but in the ways it spread. Most anthropologists conclude that cranial modification sprang up independently in separate corners of the world, but in the case of the Hun Germanic tribes, we have evidence for a linear chain of cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion is simply when some cultural practice is adopted by another culture. A study done in 2014 showed that the chain began somewhere in Central Asia around the 1st century BC, and was adopted by the early Huns, who then spread it to Eastern and Central Europe during the infamous Hun invasions around 300 years later. Here the practice existed until approximately the 6th century AD, and it even diffused into some parts of Western Europe. So my earlier statement about Western Europeans not practicing cranial modification is not entirely true. However, the instances of the practice found in countries like Germany and France could be considered a kind of short-lived fashion trend. But nonetheless, it's a remnant of an ancient, widespread, and purely human practice. Or so they want you to think.